at so I'm really interested in like studying Boston neighborhoods. I use a lot of like online data like Twitter and Craigslist and stuff, and I can talk about that more later if anyone's interested. But as a data consultant, it's really my job to kind of like spread the Bari gospel, right? Like find anyone who like could use our data for something and like teach them how to use it. Maybe someone has like a really interesting research question that they're not quite sure, like what kind of data could help answer that, right? It's like my job to kind of like guide you all through that and like help you all answer like the research questions, that you want to answer, right? Because you all are the ones who are out there really kind of like on the ground, right? So like, we want to do our best to kind of like equip you to kind of like, I don't know, do the best work that you can. And so to kind of like the way that this will go today is we'll talk a little bit like amongst ourselves about kind of who you all are, kind of like what brought you here today. And then we're going to go over a couple different data tools that Bari offers. So one is based around maps. So we'll look at like maps of kind of like different features of Boston neighborhoods, hopefully find some stuff that you all identify as being interested in. And then I'll show you where you can actually like download our data. People interact with Bari's data at different levels. Some people, they just like really want to see a map. And then there's a certain kind of like nerd like myself who like really wants to actually like download the data and like calculate my own statistics and stuff, right? So I'll kind of like show you where our like data portal for that is in case anyone has need for that. And then at the end, kind of as David was saying, we just kind of talk about, reflect a little bit on the training, what's been learned here, and I'll be around to answer any questions. And before I kind of get in to all of who you are, I just want to plug, as a data consultant, it is like my job to kind of like help anyone in the Boston area with kind of like help answer research questions, right? So if you like kind of like maybe I plant a seed today and then like a couple weeks or even a month down the line, you're like, oh, like this thing from the Bari training like could have been helpful, or like maybe that guy would like know something about this, right? You're like welcome to reach out over email. You can email the Bari email, or there's like a data consultant email. So like we're very kind of like looking for people to help out with this kind of stuff. So I just wanted to like plug that in, that like our connection doesn't necessarily need to like end at 2:30 today. And so on that note, I want to kind of like learn a little bit more about like all of you. So I'm wondering if we could just go around, and if you all could just tell me kind of like your name, what like organization, or if you're not from an organization, just like how you identify, and then kind of like talk a little bit about like what issues or questions are like important to you kind of like in terms of this training. And as you talk, I'm actually gonna be like writing down these topics. So hopefully when we get to the mapping section, I can kind of like tailor that around the stuff that you all are interested in. So does anyone want to kind of like volunteer to lead us off here?
I can start off. So my name is Neil Tembelkar. I'm a director of strategic initiatives at Boston Children's Museum. And really, I'm here more for kind of TBD reasons. I'm trying to just add more tools to my tool belt, so then that way when it comes to making certain decisions, I'll be able to do a bunch of market research and population analysis and kind of help us make decisions about where we want to spend our efforts. And this will help, I'm hoping, with certain decisions down the line, which I don't even know what those will be yet. It might have to do with engaging certain demographics within the city for a certain endeavor or otherwise. So, really just hoping to, sharpen my skills and learn about the portal, because that's something which I think is important for all of us to just know at least how to access it, what we can learn from it, even if, some of the specifics are not certain yet. So thank you, Riley, for teaching us.
Yeah, it's like, okay, if you don't have like an answer to this question yet, but you said you're like interested in thinking of like demographics that you might want to target. Like, if you're just to guess, like what demographic features would you be looking for? Like, this, yeah.
No, I think I'd be looking in the dimensions of like certain socioeconomic information, where certain, also geographic distribution, and how that relates to the socioeconomic realities of Boston in terms of like which neighborhoods we might want to identify for certain work. But then beyond that as well, sort of, also some information around where we might want to engage communities to become museum members, for example, or it could have to do with student population in a certain area, how many students are attending a private school versus a public school. And so, and it's that type of information that I'm hoping I can extract from this type of a database. And I'm sure there are other dimensions that haven't even come to mind that will also be useful. So I'm hoping that will kind of reveal itself during this session.
Yeah. Hopefully it can give you some kind of like new ways of thinking about some of this stuff. Great. Who else wants to kind of like jump in the ring?
I'm Melanie Welch. I am Director of Community Engagement at Boston Children's Museum, and my reasons are very similar to Neil's. And I will just add, I'm particularly interested in demographics around sort of who is living in the 23 neighborhoods of Boston, and to see what's been happening, especially in Roxbury, Mattapan, Dorchester, as far as displacement. And if we are actually reaching the populations we think we're reaching when we're looking at certain zip codes.
Cool. So we've got 2 from the Children's Museum here at least. That's great. Yeah, and like we can talk more after. So like we do like trainings for organizations. So if there's like a bunch of you there who would like benefit from that, then we can like link up after and talk about if it would make sense to like tailor something for you all. But that's great. All right, who else?
I'll go next. So I'm Sharon Horrigan, and I am from the Museum of Science. And Melanie actually suggested that I kind of look at the resources here to learn more about our neighborhoods in Boston. I know some of my colleagues at the Museum of Science have also worked in using this data around heat maps in the city and some of the research work. So I'm here to kind of have this firsthand training so I could kind of get up to speed of learning what's available in the systems. And I too am particularly interested how the demographics have changed over the last 2 years in the neighborhoods across the city. So I know in looking on the website, I could see historical data and, just kind of understanding how often is that data updated and what that process is. It'd be great to learn. Thank you.
Cool. I think I'll start nominating people here. I'm going to start with people who have their cameras on. Griff.
Hi. Thanks, Riley, for hosting this. This is great. I am, my name is Griff. I'm the employment specialist at Project Place, which is a nonprofit. We're located in the South End. We're a workforce development organization that serves a lot of different populations throughout the greater Boston, but we have specific programs for people experiencing homelessness, people in recovery, so in different sober homes and sober programs throughout the area, and people who are re-entering from incarceration. And I personally really enjoy maps in general and data. And I think on twofolds, I want to better understand some of the resources available to my clients in different neighborhoods, understand kind of what neighborhoods they're in, what they have access to. I'm very interested in access to information, access to whatever sort of community development and community building resources are out there. And I've lived in Boston for about 2 years now, but I'm originally from the DC area. So also just learning the area better. And I really think space and place can inform a lot of how to best help and serve my clients.
Yes, we're all about the space and place perspective. Maybe throwing time there occasionally. Yeah, but yeah, cool. Judith.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Judith. I'm the resident wellness director at Blue Ridge Co-op. This is a building for seniors, and I'm very interested in research initiative that I have already launched with medical institutions, Brigham, Mass General hospitals, and Tufts Medical Centers. So we are promote research in dementia, cognitive impairment. And I'm very focused on how I can promote research in underrepresented communities like Haitian communities, Spanish communities, Chinese communities, especially the older adult communities. So that's the reason I'm here. I'm very interested, and thank you for doing that.
Of course. Yeah, this is super cool. And so, I want to respect the fact that sometimes people want to come to these things and like hang out and like not participate. So I just want to check before going to the next thing. Does anyone who hasn't spoken yet, like has their camera off, did you want to kind of introduce yourselves? All right. Well, that's
Hi, this is Michael Colson from Project Right. I had a hard time finding a link for this, so I'm just getting on now. Just trying to find out how to understand and adopt the 2020 census data to the neighborhood and growth hall that I work with.
all right. So your census data for Grove Hall is very targeted. Awesome. So this is great. If I'm kind of like thinking of like themes that are like represented in what you all spoke about, a lot of stuff about like demographics, like it seems like there's like probably like some economic features people are interested in. It seems like there's also like some age, like age was actually a trend, both kind of with like younger folks, I think, and also like older folks that came up. Some like themes of like medical, kind of like some themes of like homelessness, like reentry, that kind of stuff. Yeah, and so we'll go through some of these things. You'll see we're like very kind of like well prepared to teach you all about, and like for some other things there's gonna be some challenges, but when those challenges come up, we can kind of like talk about it, and like maybe you'll have some ideas that we can move forward with. And so before we get into kind of the going over the data, obviously you're all at a training right now, because like you probably don't feel like you're like a master of these resources, right? At some point you've probably hit some kind of challenge in trying to use data to kind of like solve a problem, and that has brought you here. So I was kind of wanted to ask, like, what are some difficulties that like people in this room have encountered when trying to use data to solve a problem in work, right? Like what's kind of like an example, or kind of like it can be a specific example, or it could be just kind of like broad challenges that you face when trying to use data to learn about the demographics of a neighborhood, for example, or to learn about like the socioeconomic status of a neighborhood. When I kind of like pose that, does anyone have any ideas that come to mind?
I mean, just very simply outdated, like I look and I see that it was something that was, a decade ago and it hasn't been updated, and I'm looking to speak to the now.
Yep, totally. That is a big thing, I think, for data, just like kind of how quickly can it get kind of like churned out and kind of like shared with everyone. Yeah, that's a big one. So have any other ideas come to mind?
I find kind of translating the data to the why, especially if you're conveying the data or trying to communicate to different audiences. Some who may not be numbers based, so kind of like one using storytelling and using more like quantitative data to kind of combining those qualitative and quantitative data and explaining why it's important to our organization. A lot of times looking at the bottom line.
Yeah, so I mean, if I'm kind of like paraphrasing a little bit, it seems like kind of like the challenge would be like creating meaning from data, right? I wonder if like anyone else kind of had that experience where like maybe you like wanted to look up like poverty rates in Boston, you see like a huge table of like a bunch of numbers, and like you have no idea like what that means. Like, has anyone ever kind of like had that kind of thing happen where you like look up data and it like seems like you find it, but like who knows what it is?
Yes,
I definitely have, yeah.
And another challenge could be potentially finding that data to begin with. Like I know, I think it was Mike mentioned like using the census data. If you go onto like the Census Data Explorer, it's not just easy as looking up like race of like Bostonians, right? There's like thousands of tables that all have like very similar stuff in them. Judith, what were you thinking?
Yes, I think the most challenging for me, it's the disproportion. So what the data says and what I'm observing in the community. That's the one, that's the very frustrating part. For some reason, people, for cultures believe, so they don't answer. directly to the question. So the inadequate cultural competence, I don't know, but that's my challenge.
Interesting. So you find like the data maybe doesn't reflect reality.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. Did you have like any specific examples in mind when you were saying that? Like I wonder, because you were talking about like cultural competency. Like I'm kind of thinking that like you've like had a specific time that you ran into this, or like maybe like a specific thing about your community that you've like found that's like misinterpreted in the data. I'd just be curious to kind of like hear more about that.
Yeah, so I think the classical example is mental health, like depression. Some question you are maybe you ask in such community, and those questions doesn't appropriate in the Black or brown communities. So that bring a lot of bias and false studies or false result. So that's a classical example.
Yeah, that is really good. Yeah, and like one of the things, when I'm going through data today, you all should like are like very free to ask me like, how did this data get created, right? Like, what is the original source, right? Because like we're not as an organization, like BARI doesn't really do surveys, right? Like we're not out on the ground like collecting our own data. We really like compile stuff, right? So like kind of like we're gonna go through like a whole bunch of different data today, and like some of them are gonna come from the census. Some of them might come from like something we scraped online, right? And so it's like really, like where the data come from really does have implications, and it does, create challenges if kind of like the data doesn't reflect reality, right? Like I think as using data, we want to understand the world better, right? And so when the data doesn't actually like reflect the world correctly, like that's just like a big problem for using the data and also for like reaching our goals with the data, right? It's like we don't want to make decisions off like the wrong data because we might make the wrong decision, right? Or like the decision that we wouldn't have made if we had like complete accurate information. So this is great. Before I get into it, did anyone have any other, if so, kind of like themes of data challenges I've got here are data is outdated. It can be hard to kind of like create knowledge or like meaning from data, and that data is not always like accurate. Does anyone have any other kind of like data or kind of like research challenges in mind they want to bring to the table? Sharon.
I'm also just thinking, in addition to the census, I know that our hospitals or health organizations, are doing surveys regularly, at least, every 3 years. And so I don't know if you are collating kind of the ongoing research of other teams as well in the community and how that is shared.
Yeah, no, I mean, we try to get as much data as we can. So like the healthcare is like a really tricky one because of HIPAA. Like I know like, and obviously like not everything is HIPAA protected, but like a lot of like the kind of like basic information that you might want, like neighborhoods that have more health issues, it's like really hard to get that. Like I think like for like several years now, we've been trying to get roads on like health data like that. But a lot of this stuff happens like pretty organically, right? It's like, BARI has been building up kind of like a scene of like people in Boston who like use data. And as we all talk, it's kind of like we realize, like, oh, it'd be great if like you could share this map with BARI. So like we just got one a map of redlining. So I haven't even actually looked at this yet. This is like specifically like my boss was like writing a book and he found this data set and he's using it. He's like, oh, like this is like incredible data. And he just like emailed, I think it's like Professor at Brown or something, right? He's just like, hey, can we put this on the data portal? And it's like, it's actually like getting maps from like an individual is often a lot easier than getting it from like a massive organization, especially like a government org. But like we do have these connections, right? So like Boston Police Department, we get data from them. There's like several teams at the city hall, so we get like, and we'll go over this all again in a moment, but like property assessments data, right? Building permits, some stuff we do get directly from the city, but city government and like kind of like their data warehouses are very fractured. Like the 311 people is a completely different team from the 911 team. You know what I mean? So it's like every time we want to get like a data on some topic, it is kind of like a lot of like relationship building, even to get in a position where like we even where we know who the person is to ask. A lot of times in City Hall, it's like a dead end. And it's like a problem with anyone in City Hall. It's just it's like such a convoluted network of different data people and kind of like data storage systems. So did that answer your question, Sharon? I feel like I kind of went off on a tangent there.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Cool. So are we all ready to look at some maps now, or anything else? Yeah, okay. I think
I just had one thing that I'm also interested in. It's not really a dilemma, but just what efforts are going on in terms of like crowdsourced data and like participatory sort of, using people in their neighborhoods to actually collect data about their own neighborhoods, essentially.
Yeah, and so I mean, it depends on like what you have in mind for like crowdsource. So like we use like a lot of scrape data these days. So like stuff from Craigslist, stuff from Twitter, stuff from Airbnb. So like one might call that crowdsource in the way that it's like naturally generated data by people who aren't trying to like create data. But and like this is something I think is like more like on the horizon. But like within the last couple of years, we had a new professor join us, Moira Zellner, and she's like an expert in participant like modeling and stuff. So she's and I know like specifically with like climate stuff, there's like they've been applying for a ton of grants this year to do like participant like observatory modeling around like climate resilience. So it's definitely something that's like on the brains of this organization. But as far as like collecting like measures directly from people, like I don't think anything that I'm going to show you today is quite in that realm. Any other questions before we start looking at some maps here? All right. And so I'm about to share my screen with you. I'm going to put a link in the chat just in case anyone wants to follow along. If you just want to follow along on my screen, that's perfectly fine. It's like one of the challenges of doing this on Zoom is it's not necessarily that easy for someone to like follow along on their own screen while watching me. But either way should work. Okay. Share screen. Do you all see the Boston area BARI website shared? Cool. So what this is this is the Boston data portal. This is really kind of like the home base for all of BARI's data. And so kind of as I was saying before, we like understand that people engage with our data in like different levels, right? There's like a user who just like wants to make a quick map of kind of like, percent Hispanic across Boston, right? And then there's someone who wants to like do like a really fancy, like, they want to take that measure and like do some crazy statistics with it, right? So we've tried to kind of like create multiple areas of engagement where like, there's like a resource that's kind of like ready to like meet you where you're at, hopefully. And so I see like the research map as being like the more accessible way of interacting with our data. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click on this button here, and it takes you over to our research map. And so I don't know if anyone here is like interested in kind of like mapping technology, but in case, this is built off ArcOnline. So if you've ever used ArcGIS, they have a web-based platform for that, and it kind of allows us to like stick a ArcMap online in an interactive format. And if you don't know what that means, in a moment, you'll kind of like see what I'm talking about. And so at the top of our page here, we break kind of like all of BARI's data, or most of it, I should say, into 4 main categories. So like if we kind of take like, the mass of everything that BARI puts out to the world in terms of data, it kind of all breaks down into one of these 4 categories, right? Housing and land value is like stuff all about buildings. Commerce and institutions tends to be more around like financial, commercial stuff. People and environments, I think, is relatively self-explanatory. I think we're going to spend a lot of time there today because people are interested in demographics. And then crime and disorder. We have a couple different sources of like crime data that we release. And so given, let me just make sure I have my page out with all of your interest on it. Since people are interested in demographics, I want to start over at people and environments. And so as you click on it, you should see a map come up in the middle of the screen. And so just kind of like giving like a basic lay of the land here. At the top, you have red buttons that indicate the different data sets. So like it's by census by default, but if I click census here, we know that we're looking at census data, right? So like everything on this page is going to be from the census, and if we wanted to go to a different data set, we would click over. Can ignore that for now, right? So looking at the census. On the left here are all of our different data points. And these are kind of categories, data points. I'll show you that in a moment. But the way that we make them come up on the map or disappear is using these eyeballs, right? So you see this eyeball here. If I unclick, or if I click all these eyeballs so they're closed, right? You see like a little line goes through it. If I click through all of these, then we have no map, right? There's no data being visualized. We just have a blank map. And so like this is like a legit map behind it, right? So this is what's called the base map. And if you wanted to, you can click on it and you can move it around, right? You can click this plus button and you can zoom into a specific location, or you can zoom out, right? This is basically just like a Google Maps type view. And right, what differentiates it from Google Maps, of course, is that you can layer bar data on top of it. And so what I'm going to do is, since like economic stuff came up from our discussion, why don't we start there? So if I click open this triangle, it's going to show us all of the data that we publish for economic standings. And I'm going to turn this off, right? So we have eyes off for everything. If I turn on the eyeball for economic standing, it kind of like unlocks these one. So now let's look at unemployment rate. So when I click this eyeball now for unemployment rate, now we have a map of unemployment in Boston. And so this comes from this census. So each one of these polygons is a census tract, which it's kind of like a specific thing for the census, but it's a geography that contains on average like 6,000 people, right? So each of these polygons kind of has roughly the same amount of people living in it. And so your question might be like, the colors look nice, but what do the colors even mean? Right? And so we make available a legend, which if you click this button here in the upper right corner, this is kind of our legend. It's a little basic. We have like more documentation that I'll show you kind of like by the end of today. But what these are is percentages, or yeah, percentages divided by 100. So basically what this is saying is that in the areas that are in dark blue, on average, around like 9.6% of residents are like under the national unemployment line. Like that's like the census picks some dollar amount and they kind of like, I think they ask how much someone earns, and then they like, you know, if someone's under, they like count for this. So at the bottom end of the spectrum, in like this white color, those are neighborhoods where like less than 1% of residents are on unemployment, right? And so it's interesting, right? I mean, like, I don't think this is too surprising to anyone who's kind of like lived in Boston, or at least like knowledgeable about Boston, but there's like real economic inequities, right? We can see there are some neighborhoods that there's a lot of unemployment, and then they are right next to neighborhoods that have very little, right? And I think I forgot to mention this, but if you click on a polygon, you can see the actual value for this. So like, say I wanted to know about the unemployment in my specific neighborhood, which I can tell you is here. If I click on that, sometimes it's a little tricky, you gotta like zoom in. I can see like the unemployment rate like for around my neighbors, which is like kind of interesting. And so trying to think of what I want to show off next here. Well, I think that the inequality discussion oftentimes kind of like centers around like, just like pure dollar amounts type of stuff. But there's like a lot of different dimensions of that. And one that I always find really interesting is commute method. I know if you like asked me before I moved to Boston, like, is there neighborhood differences in how people get to work? I would probably be like, no, it's just like an individual decision. Some people like to walk to work, some people like to take the T, whatever. And so I'm gonna turn on this eyeball so we can look at these. And first, let's look at commute by walking, right? And so if I pull up the legend here, the darker polygons are where a higher percentage of residents walk to work. And it's a really stark map, right? Like what this is showing us is that if you live in like directly downtown Boston, like there's like a pretty good chance that you walk to work, right? Alternatively, if you live on kind of like the outskirts of town, it's like a much, much lower, right? Like zero. It's like basically no people who kind of are living in certain kind of like pockets of Hyde Park report walking to work. And I'd be kind of like curious to hear from the room. I mean, I have my ideas, but why do we think that it is residents of downtown walk to work so much while people in kind of like other neighborhoods are walking to work at like far less?
Because most of the people work in downtown Boston.
Okay, so you think that everyone in Boston probably works in downtown Boston, so the people downtown have luxury of walking while it's too far to walk for the others. Is that kind of like what you were thinking?
Potentially, yeah. Maybe there's more chances for employment downtown than in the other areas for people. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I definitely think you're spot on there. And so if we're thinking of, right, like if all these people are working downtown, like let's make that assumption, I think it's like a good one. These people like are still need to get to work downtown, right? But it's going to change how they get there. So if we turn off walking and we turn on car, right? It's like, it's different because in Boston, I mean, we all know driving sucks in Boston. People aren't really trying to drive in general. However, it is really only those neighborhoods that are furthest from downtown that are like using cars and kind of like a moderate amount, right? If you live downtown, it's like people are saying like, no way, like I will just walk to work, or right, I will just, okay, everyone uses public transportation, that's a bad example. But biking, right? Like here's another kind of example. It's a little bit different, right? Like when it comes to biking, people in kind of like Brookline and Allston and like JP, everyone there is like down to bike in apparently. But I mean, it does kind of like match with that pattern, right? Everyone is trying to get downtown to work, and some people live further away. And so thinking about like commuting and commute times across neighborhoods, if you were
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your thing. I was just curious if this data is trying to pull, is it accounting for people who may have a mixed commute, as in like part walking, part public transit?
Yeah, so this is from the census. So I would guess they probably just asked a question like, how do you get to work most often? But yeah, I mean, like it is. Oh, did you mean like if you like have to like walk to like 10 minutes to a subway station type of thing?
Right. Or a mix of like, oh, well, the closest stop is here, and then the bus doesn't get me there fast enough, so I walk from the train station instead. So I have kind of a mix of walking and public transit, or would that be just counted as public transit probably?
That would probably be counted as whoever took the thing, right? Because like
Fair.
yeah, it's like not like a qualitative interview, right? Like it's probably like there's probably some bubbles, and like someone had to pick one. Yeah, I mean that is like an interesting point though. and maybe interesting to know like how many people are kind of like having dual dual strategy commutes. There's probably someone in public transport who's thinking about that, but it's interesting, and to think about like what kind of data that would require, right? Like a much like kind of longer survey. Neil.
Sorry if you already mentioned this, but is this only pulling from the 2010 census, or is this also pulling from 2020 census?
No, so right now what this is this, and this is just because like we haven't updated our map part. This is currently for the 2018-2014 ACS. Yeah, so for all of you, like for people who like aren't kind of like using the census data a lot, so I think most people are familiar that the census is the decennial census, right? It's like every 10 years they ask like every single person in America, in theory, kind of like some basic information about themselves. As you can all imagine, like places change like more rapidly than every 10 years, right? Like stuff happens in 2015 between those decennial censuses. So they have a program called the American Community Survey. And the problem is like there's just not enough money to like survey people every year, like the whole country, right? It's just like very expensive. So they have this American Community Survey program where like every year they're doing like a smaller survey. I don't know exactly like how many people it is. I don't want to put like a fake number on it, but it's like a very small percentage of like Americans get surveyed every year, like on off years. And like the 1 year, it's like not really enough to kind of like learn about neighborhoods. But if you average 5 years together, and so this is what we normally use. So like you can imagine they like surveyed a small number of people in 2014, a small number of people in 2015, etc. What you can do is over the 5-year period, you can like aggregate up, you can kind of like sum all of them in a bucket, and you can say, okay, this is what the neighborhood looked like from that period of like 2014 to 2018. And granted, it's not ideal because there is like annual change. But just like it's like kind of like the most robust information we have. Like if you look at kind of like 1 year ACS data, like they can't release very much of it because like so much of it's like risking you're identifying some census respondent because they're like the only person in their neighborhood who took the survey type of thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone have like while I'm talking about it, does anyone have questions kind of about how the census works? One thing that's interesting to mention is every 10 years, they also redraw these polygons. So like these neighborhood maps for like 2010 to 2020 will like technically change. Like we need to kind of like redo that part of the process. But yeah, I don't know. Did anyone have any, like we all use like, or have like taken the census and it's like kind of like the key data source of how we like learn about demographics. Does anyone have any like thoughts or questions about the census, how it works?
Is the ACS the same everywhere, or would there be like Boston specific questions in the Boston community survey, and Miami will have Miami specific questions?
No, yeah, it's still done by the census, so it's like still like the national organization. Like we have something called the Boston Neighborhood Survey that is like specific questions that like people in Boston came up with, but it's like unaffiliated with the census. It's just like researchers want to do their own thing. So yeah, so like you could do, and I mean, for my own research, I've been using like a shapefile of the ACS that has like every block in the country. So it's all standardized.
Thank you.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How do they determine, you see each section that you mentioned, they have different borders. How do they determine how to set that up, or why did they set it up like this with these particular shapes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so there's a lot that goes into it. So like I said, census wants to make a map for the entire US. So if you can actually imagine, like this map exists for like the whole entire country, right? So the census says we just want some denomination where like every kind of like there's a unit that goes all over the US, and every one of these units has approximately 6,000 people living in them. So it's interesting, right? Because if you look at like, I don't think we have it here, but like if you were to look at like out here, not Worcester, but like out here, like a tract is huge. right? Like, because it's like rural, right? People are like living far apart from each other. Like you need like several miles just to get 6,000 people, where like in Boston, in some areas, you can get 6,000 people in like a couple of blocks. So there's some kind of, and like this is where it's like getting past my knowledge exactly, but they have like, you can imagine they have like a dot on the map for everyone like who lives in the country. They do some kind of geographic like analysis to identify like, okay, like here's like a plot of like where 6,000 people live, right? Trying to get them kind of like similar. They also do pay attention to like natural landmarks. So like you can see like these are split down like a major street right here, which is always interesting. Or at least I think that's the case. And you have weird, so like they pay attention to like where the streets get separated. They like pay attention to waterways, as you can see. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's probably like a massive team of people that has to like figure out every 10 years how to like redraw these boundaries. Did that help answer your question, or is there anything I can like help clarify?
Yeah, it answers some of my question.
Cool. Yeah, it's confusing. There's some genius, I think, in the census that is just like a master of spatial analysis.
Riley, I have a different question. I was just also trying to do this on my own through the link, and in order to know exactly what neighborhoods, you know, that the coloration, the shading covers, is there any way to just hover over it? Or, I mean, I know that you can call up a zip code and it will bring you to that part of the map, but I'm just wondering if there's another way to see the actual names of the areas.
So for the actual names of the neighborhoods, it's a little bit tricky because like everyone has a different idea of what a neighborhood should be. I mean, I think it'll be easier to show you on one of our other pages, but like different kind of like you know, like ISD in Boston Police Department have like two completely different neighborhood maps. And like people, there's like a lot of research that like people who live in neighborhoods have different kind of like boundaries in mind of where like than what the city uses or whatever. However, if you look closely here, you can see like there is like labeled on this map, right? Like
Okay.
Jamaica Plain. So in a little bit, I'm going to show you kind of like a more flexible tool. And when we get there, what you could do is you could make the colors on these more translucent, so you'd be able to see underneath a little bit better. And it's not perfect, right? It's not like here's like a polygon specifically for like Jamaica Plain or whatever, but you'd at least be able to kind of like show your viewer like, okay, like here's kind of like the basic neighborhoods that like Google Maps, I think it's like OpenStreetMaps, but like that they've picked. Does that make sense? Cool.
Thank you.
And so as far as like thinking of creating meaning out of this data and these kind of like commute methods, so right, this is a map of like commute by walking, right? The people downtown walk to work, and the people outside do less of that. Do we think if we're comparing the people who live downtown and the people who live on the outskirts, just like based on these patterns, do we think that there is going to be neighborhood differences in how long it takes people to get to work?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
So we've got a couple of yeses. And so if we were to imagine like a map, I can like, it doesn't make sense to turn this off. I'd probably leave it on. If we were to think of a map of like, where are the high commute times, right? So like, I'm gonna put a layer up and like the darker polygons will be like the neighborhoods where people have to travel further. Where, like, what parts of the city do you think are gonna have those longer commute times? Like where will those darker polygons be?
Further away from the city center, I guess.
Away from the city center. Yep. We might also imagine, that's a bad one again. maybe these polygons that have like a lot of people driving to work, right? Like partially because driving to work suggests that you have to go a long way, but also like traffic gets crazy in Boston, right? Like maybe these people are just like kind of hitting traffic, stuff that you don't have to hit on the T or if you're walking. And so we can look at that, right? Like this is like what you all just made are hypotheses, right? About kind of like what does commute strategy do to commute time, right? We hypothesize that if you don't walk, you got to have a longer trip. And we can look at that directly, right? So if we go to commute time here, and I turn on the eyeball for commute over 90 minutes, I think that's roughly like what folks just described, right? Is it like downtown Boston, like where all these people are walking, it's like very few people kind of have a long commute. But then you get out to like Dorchester and Chelsea, where like all these jobs downtown are less accessible. It ends up being like a much kind of longer drive to work, right?
But could that, I mean, say for instance, like I used to live in Dorchester and it would take me sometimes a half an hour to 45 minutes to get into downtown. I live in Rosendale now. It takes me 10 to 15 minutes on the commuter rail. So I live further away, but I get in quicker. So I think how you get into the city matters too. Driving could be more congested than if you're on a commuter rail where there's no traffic.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So like if we look at this kind of like Dorchester area, like this is like clearly like the part of Boston, it's like a hot spot for like low commutes
Congestion.
or long commutes. Yeah, I mean, so we can look, right? Like we look at like the public transportation one. I wish the public transportation map wasn't just like one color all across. But if let's see, I want to turn this off and then turn this on. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because it seems like people in those areas, like at least from our data, it seems like they're not really driving to work. And I don't know, it is interesting to think about. Like you wonder, is the T take a long time, right? I mean, it's hard, right, when we're thinking of data this aggregated. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think that you're right. That kind of like looking at this also kind of just like could indicate kind of like transportation network inefficiencies, right? Like this is just like a transportation corridor that it's like really kind of like hard to get through downtown or to downtown. Right. While we're here, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say another thing that I thought was interesting that you could pull, especially if you go to the commute by auto and kind of zoom in by Jamaica Plain, you can see that there's that blue strip of people who commuted that sort of, yeah. And I think it has to do one with the right along Jamaica Way, which is the easier route to get on. And also if you live along that route, those houses are probably pretty expensive. So you probably own a car as well too. Whereas if you get just outside in Jamaica Plain, it looks like fewer people are driving by car.
Yeah, this is really good. And this is such a funny polygon. I think this really is like a great example of how the census will draw crazy neighborhoods to try to fit like 6,000 residents in. I mean, that's just like such a strange neighborhood boundary. But yeah, no, I mean, yeah, it's a really great point. Yeah, so I think this was interesting. I'm trying to think. So we have like a little, I probably want to, let's see. I'm just thinking of finding anything here. We've had so much demographic discussion here. Okay, one thing I want to get over, because we should look at some of these other maps as well. One of the themes that came up was medical kind of like issues, and while I said we don't have that much in the way of medical information, we do have, oh wait, we don't have it up here. Sorry, I was just making a false promise. So normally we have in our data that I'll show you a little bit, we have a measure of 911 calls for medical emergencies. Apparently that never got added to the map, but that's okay. I'm just looking through my list here. Okay, let's hang out on demographics some more. So actually age was something that came up. I think there was someone who said they were interested in kind of like thinking about targeting youth, and then there was someone who mentioned they were like work for like a senior living facility. This is interesting, right? Because like age isn't like kind of like impacted by like segregation processes and like, you know, like commercial stuff in the same way that kind of like some of these other social measures are. And so I think if we look at age under 18, right, that's it's probably more interesting to look at 18 to 34. So if we look at this map, right, the darker blue areas are kind of like downtown and like Brooklyn, Brighton and Allston, and kind of like JP. What are the types of people that are being captured? And like we think of like 18 to 34-year-olds, what brings them to Boston? Broadly, there's like
education and early, jobs.
yes,
And
yes,
entertainment.
definitely entertainment. Yeah, there's a whole social thing right now from a lot of young people moving into cities. Yeah, but like kind of like education is what I had in mind, right? Like Boston is a major college town, and I think actually this might be a good opportunity. So what we can actually do to kind of like dig into that a little bit is we can like put dots over this map to see where all the colleges are, right? And if it turns out that like what we're kind of like capturing here is like college students, then we should see these kind of like darker blue areas have more colleges in them. I see something in the chat, just want to make sure. Okay, I know this one before. And so I'm going to click out of here. So these maps are really great for looking at kind of like data that Bari makes available. But like if any of you had asked questions of like, how do I kind of like make this prettier for like a project, there's not much, right? Like these pages specifically here are like kind of like what you see is what you can get. It's like a really easy way to look at data. But sometimes you want to make a pretty picture, right? Or you want to like look at a specific association. And so down here is what we've created. It's called the data playground. And so this is it's like a slightly more kind of like complicated, I guess is a fair way to put it, version of the map platform. It has like extra buttons on it, but those extra buttons allow you to kind of like customize and like do your own kind of like maps, answer your own research questions. And so now I am at the playground here. And so as you can see, it's like a little bit different. Like we have more panels and stuff. So I'm gonna go to layers here. And this is kind of similar to what we were looking at before, but each of our envelopes, instead of being like a specific topic of data, it is like a whole data set, right? So if I want to pull back up the mapping people thing, the age data is what we're looking at. I'm going to open this envelope for Boston Neighborhood Survey. I'm going to, oh wait, that's the wrong one. I want to go to American Community Survey. And I'm going to find, I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to find the one that says age, right? So here's one for percent of residents, age is 18 to 34. Just like before, if I click on the eyeball, it kind of makes the map. And so I actually mentioned this earlier. I was mentioning that the census goes for the whole country. This shapefile that we're looking at now is actually for Massachusetts, right? So you can see like Massachusetts is full of census tract and they get huge in kind of like the middle of the state, right? So like that whole polygon there, you need that much space to fit 6,000 people in it. Anyways, that's just kind of like a tangent from earlier. I'll scroll back to Boston here. And so one thing that's really cool is that now that we have like all of our data together, we can layer stuff on top of each other, right? So like I was saying before, it might be interesting to put like some dots on the maps of where all the colleges are in Boston to kind of compare that to where the young people are living. And so what I can do is I can go to layers and I'm going to close this envelope for a second. It's still up, right? We still got the eyeball on. And what I need is a parcel of interest. So these come from the property assessment data. Haven't ended up talking about this today, but we get like a data set from the city every year. That's just kind of like every building in the city, basically. And so we've kind of like picked some categories of buildings that we think are specifically interesting. And so if I click the eyeball on for universities and colleges, oh yeah, you don't see it. This is one of these things. So these are layers, right? They literally go on top of each other and they go in order of these. So what just happened is I went to turn on the parcels, the dots, but right now our polygons are actually layered on top of the dots, right? So you can't see underneath that at all. And there's actually two ways that we could change that. I'm gonna do this. So I'm just gonna scroll it up in the list. And then you see some polygons come through. Right, so it's kind of cool. And I'll clean this up in a minute. You all can kind of like see how that goes. But each one of these polygons that you see here is a specific college. And so this one might not say. A lot of the colleges, like you can click on it and you can see exactly like what university it is. But what's cool is it's not just like a dot on the map, right? It is like the literal footprint of where the building is, kind of like indicating like its size and its shape and everything. So it's cool, right? You like really get a sense of like, you know, this neighborhood has 2 college buildings and so does this one, but clearly this one here has like some massive kind of like complex where this one just has a couple of buildings. And right, and so this thing is flexible. We can kind of like change it as we want. And so if we go to layers, I want to change the color of the colleges so that we can like see them more clearly. If I click on that, now over here, we have all kinds of different stuff that we can do. Sorry. I know what it is. Sorry, I have to scroll. Oh, wait. Number one. What I have to do is I have to go here and you have to click on the specific layer. Okay, so now I've got properties up. And now if I go to styles, right? So I've selected the universities and colleges, and I can go through these menus to pick a style, and I can change the color. Right? I'm not like a color theorist, so I don't know exactly what color is going to look good on blue, but I think this pink will stand out. Right? And all of a sudden, those universities, the footprint is much easier to see, right? And so one thing that's driving me absolutely bonkers right now is that we have the shapefile for all of Massachusetts. And so you can actually filter out stuff. And this is like a little bit of an advanced technique, but it's going to make our map look really nice. So if I go to the layer we have open, I can go to filter, right? So like filter is like saying I want to like keep or remove certain things, right? And like there's like a menu here where I can kind of let's see, does not, oh wait, is starts with, sorry, I'm thinking about this through my head. So this is kind of like a weird hack. I know just like because of how the census works, that like every census tract in Boston starts with the numbers 25025, right? It's just like a random administrative code. I'm like a nerd enough with this data that I just like know that's a property of it. So if I limit the data to polygons where the census tract ID starts with 2525 and I save it, why did that save? Oh, there we go. It just takes a second, right? Sorry, I like a lot of stuff on my screen right now. Right now we have a map of just Boston, right? I was able to like kind of filter out the rest of the Massachusetts and kind of, like highlight just Boston and the colleges here and kind of the young people. And so I'm running up on time. We've got to go into the data portal. But one last thing here. What do we think of the association between young people in Boston and colleges, right? So these areas with the darker blue polygons are kind of like where the young people are more concentrated, and these purple polygons are actual university buildings. Do we think there's a relationship where young people are like tending to live around colleges, or do we think that there's something else going on?
I think there's definitely a geographic relationship between, the fact that the young people live there and the fact that they're there to be near universities.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you want to describe a little bit of like what patterns you're seeing on the map that like lead to that conclusion?
Well, so I'm seeing a darker saturation, of color, which is associated with, my understanding is a higher percentage of that younger age demographic that happen to be right next to a lot of the pink university areas. So, I mean, that's kind of the extent of the analysis of them.
Yeah, just it can be helpful to kind of like unpack it sometimes. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because like Seaport-ish is like a part of the city where like a whole bunch of young people live, and there's no universities, right? Like, and you need more data to kind of like unpack this. But I hypothesize that is like young professionals, right? Those are people who are like working downtown. They don't care to be close to university. In fact, they probably want to be like away from some of like the student ruckus, right? So it's kind of interesting, right? You can kind of like, it's just like assumptions, right? And kind of like educated guesses, but the data kind of like helps us get a little bit closer. And so before I go over to the data portal, I see if there's a question in the chat here. So Christina asks, can you see a time lapse of how neighborhood demographics are changing over time? So there's no real like kind of like nice time lapse tool. So there's no like way of making animation. We're currently in the process of like updating the American Community Survey. We actually have to like read. So this map platform we like did within the last year. And now that we're getting to the point, because we do like to update these every year, right? That was like something that came up at the beginning of this training. For like as much as possible, we're updating our data sets every year. Some of them, if they're released more often, we do it like bi-yearly or whatever. But we need to like rethink through like what would it look like to have kind of like a measure for percent Black residents for like every ACS from like 2010 to now, right? Like how does that look in the map platform? So we're still kind of thinking through like what's the best way to kind of like, share some of the longitudinal stuff. But on the data side, we have a lot of good files that do that directly. So that's actually a good transition here. And if you have any questions about the map platform at the end, or we can talk about that, or you're welcome to email me. So I'm going to go back to our homepage here, right? This is that link that I shared in the chat before. As you can see, we have a whole bunch of maps on a whole bunch of stuff. We really only looked at like a pretty small portion of it, actually. But right, there's like more kind of like depth that you may want to engage with, or you may just like want to pull the numbers, like see that we're doing everything right. Right, so here we have the Boston data library. And so this is the Dataverse is a page managed by Harvard, and it's really built around kind of like publishing data sets. And so we use that to kind of like publish our data and share them. And so I'm gonna click on the Redlining Boston one just because it just got published, right? So this just got published on April 4th. And so I can click on this. And this brings us to kind of like the data portal page for this data set, right? And so you have a description that gives you kind of like basic information. This is like a data set on redlining across neighborhoods in 239 cities, right? And you also get like kind of like the nitty gritty about who put this all together and then what our role here is. And so this is a great example because it actually includes like the three main kinds of files that we tend to share and publish. And so first, let's look at the documentation. And so you notice there's like an eyeball button. So we can like kind of like preview stuff in this page. So let's look at documentation. And you have to put some stuff in here. You should put your real stuff, but just because of what we're doing here, I'm just gonna do this and it'll work. So this is a documentation file. For every data set that we publish a documentation file because we want people who are using our data to know exactly how everything was created, where the information comes from, right? Like kind of like as complete information as possible about what the data represents, right? So you can make kind of like educated decisions. Oh, like does this data source reflect reality? It's just going through like the basic parts of it. There's like an overview that's really kind of like in-depth information about what's included. But what I wanted to highlight is it describes what every single column in every single data set is, right? So like sometimes, like I know in my experience, I download like a Excel file off the internet and then it has column names that are just like completely indecipherable, right? Like I have no idea, like this might as well just be like gibberish. I don't know what it means. And I can't say that our column names are any better exactly, but what we do is we kind of like release this documentation that says exactly what every single column is, right? So like before on the map, I was playing around with that CTIT10 variable and I didn't explain it. The documentation says it's the unique identifier for each census tract, right? So I suggest like anytime that you're trying to use one of our data sets, like the very first thing that you want to do is kind of like look at documentation. And then if you have questions, you know, you can reach out to us. And a lot of times the person that put this data together like is on the team, right? And so if I exit back, so tab files are kind of like what you all can like kind of think of as like an Excel file or whatever. It's just like a tabular data form. And if I view it, I have to do this all again. Right, so this is just like a really basic 3-column data set, right? Where each one of these is like a neighborhood, exactly one of those polygons we were looking at it. And it has grade and redline. I wish I had the other thing up still. We have time. Right, and so you're saying, oh, what do grade and redline columns mean? You can go here, and then we can see that grade is the classification of the tract. So basically like was it redlined or was it not redlined, like on a scale from A to D? And then redline is just like a dichotomous variable. If it is 1, then the neighborhood was redlined, right? So like these documentation files really are intended to kind of like cover, you know, everything that's in the data. And then the one last thing that you might see sometimes is a .zip file. And so .zip files are always a shape file. If you don't know what a shape file is, it is just a spatialized version of a CSV, right? So it's like literally the files that we were looking at on the map. This is like literally that file. We just download the zip file and we like literally drag and drop it onto the portal. It's just like all of that map data. And one thing that since there was a couple questions about longitudinal analysis, we have these files that are like specifically made for answering longitudinal questions. Let me find one. Sorry, it's a little slow. But basically, I have to go to the one. Basically, what they are is like every column is its own year. Not everyone has it. Okay, where is that? Yeah. So, and obviously not going to be like, it's all going to be kind of vague right now. But this is like one example of like our longitudinal files. And I forget what crime is AB, but this is like a count of some kind of crime. And you can see for this neighborhood, this file reports how many of that crime happened in 2014, 2015, 2016, etc. So anytime you're on the data portal and you see like LON after a file name, that means longitudinal. So to that question about kind of like looking at change over time, you would want to find like the longitudinal file for your whatever indicator you're looking at, and then it has columns in there, like giving you like cleanly kind of like year by year kind of like values. While I'm on the data portal, does anyone have any questions kind of about how this platform works before we get into our general Q&A here? All right. Well, and so like I've said a couple times now, you all are always welcome to reach out like to me or David over email if like a question comes up later. Like we are happy to answer those kind of questions. And on that note, I will pass it over to David to kind of lead us out here.
All right. Hi everyone. Hope everyone enjoyed the training. So this is the time where we just have a brief discussion, just to report out, what you guys learned. How do you envision using this in your efforts, and just what do you think about the portal in general, and if there's any insight onto how we can possibly upgrade the portal or make some changes. So if we can just go around the room really quickly, and then we'll give you guys back 5 or 10 minutes of your day. Judith, you want to start? Sharon?
Thank you, Riley, for giving us this whirlwind tour. And I was really curious, and now I feel like I've learned a little more around how to maybe create our own maps, or adding in some data points on top of what's there. So that was really helpful.
Okay. And not just only this training, you can feel free to email us and connect and schedule, maybe 15, 20 minutes with Riley. He can also just walk you through any additional questions that you may have if you need some one-on-one time as well.
Yeah, like with the example of like if there's like a map that you want to make for your organization, or like maybe like people in general your org like want to make maps, like that could be like a hour-long training. I didn't really get too much. I like flashed some things on as far as making a map. Like if you all really want to use this platform to like make publishable maps, like it's possible, right? And we're happy to kind of like set aside that time and kind of like make ourselves available.
Malene?
Hi, it's Melanie.
Malene,
That's all right. I am excited to kind of get into this, play around a bit. It's good to know how to navigate a little bit better, and where I need to go to get certain data, and then how to kind of learning how to layer it. Like that's what I was looking for in particular. So I'm going to even say excited to be able to do that. I think there's going to be a learning curve. So I'm glad that you offered the opportunity to reach out to contact you. And I just imagine that as the more I learn, the more I'm going to want to learn. And so thank you very much for this. I really appreciate it.
No problem. And if you want to possibly schedule a training with more folks at the Children's Museum, we're more than welcome to do that as well. We can do an organizational theme training as well.
Yeah, I think I will reach out about that. That might make a lot of sense for us. So thank you.
Okay. Griff, any takeaways?
Yeah, I thought it was really useful for understanding where a lot of the people that we serve at Project Place come from. The commute time and the forms of commute, I think, are really useful, something that's always a barrier to a lot of our services. But I also am really excited. So I run the DEI, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion group at Project Place, and a lot of things that we look at are, just the different barriers to access to all sorts of resources throughout the city. And this will be a really good tool to kind of bring some visualization to a lot of the stuff we talk about. Yeah. So thanks. And I will hopefully, I think I'm going to be reaching out as well.
Please do. Please do. Neil?
Hi, yes. So, Melanie and I are also on the museum's equity, diversity, and inclusion steering committee. And so, for us, I think one good thing that can come out of this is that, as a committee, we often need to make sure that we are asking the right questions. But I think that until we know that there are actual accessible answers, it's hard to know what questions to kind of focus in on. So now that I think we can, now that I know what sort of information is out there and how accessible it is, that'll help us sort of reverse engineer the right questions to ask and kind of hopefully help us and point us in the right direction. So
Absolutely. Judith, you want to close us out?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you so much again. And I really like it, to visualize my project, and also, it's such a good tools how I can unlearn and we learn. Sometimes when we are writing project that we expect, and when we get the data, it's completely different. So thank you so much. And for sure, I will email you. Thank you.
No problem. No problem. And we're going to have another training in June and in July. So if you have folks that may be interested, please be on the lookout for our email or on our website, and Twitter, Facebook. We'll definitely post that. We're going to have in June and July, we're going to have in-person trainings. This is going to be our first in-person trainings since the pandemic. So please be on the lookout for that. And I'll also be sending everyone a survey shortly after this. You should get it either later today or early tomorrow morning. If any of you guys have any questions, please feel free to email us. Email us at bari@northeastern.edu. And we're just so happy that we're able to be a resource for you guys. And please leverage us and leverage this training as well. I want to thank everyone for coming. We really appreciate it, and I hope you guys have a good week.
Thank you.
No problem.
thank you, Riley and David.